Basically, there's two reasons for the existence of this talk. Number one, when I was a member of the headquarters staff in Brooklyn, New York, we would be sent on speaking assignments within a 250-mile radius of New York City, anywhere from Washington, D.C. to Boston. And when you went on those assignments, you were expected to have a talk prepared for Saturday evening if the congregation so desired to have a talk on Saturday evening, besides the one you were to give on Sunday. And since most people on a Saturday night don't want to hear a talk on a very heavy Bible subject, well, a talk on laughter was perhaps more appropriate for that occasion. The second reason is that a lot of people have a misconception of what Jehovah's Witnesses are like. They imagine that we are somber, never telling jokes, very serious people, with our eyeballs perhaps rolled up like Father Dominic in a Xerox commercial with the scripture on the tip of our tongue all the time. But really, nothing could be farther from the truth, because Jehovah's Witnesses are very happy people, and we enjoy having a good time. As a matter of fact, I grew up in a family where we took our religion very seriously, but frankly, we had a blast being Jehovah's Witnesses. Now, in the Bible, one of the earliest mentions of laughter is in the form of a question. And strangely enough, the question is asked by God. He says, why did Sarah laugh? Now, God doesn't need to ask a question like that, because he's the man who, or rather the one who created us, and he would know why we laughed. But we're going to come back to why Sarah laughed later on in our discussion. But really, why do we laugh is a good question. And it's a difficult one to answer. Now, Scientific American made an observation that to laugh is a basic human craving. But they went on to say that for some reason, laughter has never been studied too seriously. Well, now, since that article came out in Scientific American, laughter is being studied seriously. As a matter of fact, the science of laughter is called geotology. And geotologists tell us that laughter is the privilege of man. In other words, of all the creatures here on this earth, man is the only one that laughs. You might say, now wait a minute, what about laughing hyenas? Why, even chickens cackle. Well, that's true. But try telling a joke to either of those animals. A chicken may lay an egg, it may cackle, but it didn't understand your story. You see, only man can understand humor and can respond to it with laughter. Jehovah gave those animals those sounds to make. A hyena makes a sound that to us sounds like laughter, but it's not laughing. Now this morning, we want to discuss the subject of laughter and humor from four areas. First of all, what is the cause of laughter? Secondly, are there benefits to laughing? What are the forms of humor? And then we want to wind it up with a Bible view to the entire subject here. Now, does anyone know what laughter is? Can you give me a definition? Anybody want to try? All right, Sister Mine?
It's the opposite of crying.
That's pretty good. Anybody
The opposite
else?
of crying, she
For the
said.
Bravo?
Something that amuses you.
All right.
Something that amuses
great.
you.
It's an expression of, an outward expression of your inward emotion.
Well, these are all interesting definitions. Let me read you a medical definition of what laughter is. It says, laughter is an expression of emotion consisting chiefly in certain convulsive and partly involuntary activities of the muscles of respiration, by means of which, after an inspiration, the explosion of air from the lungs in a series of interruptions produces a succession of short, abrupt movements of muscles of the face and often of other parts of the body, along with an emission of chuckling sounds from the throat. Does that make you feel good about laughing? Now, perhaps a more concise definition is from a medical dictionary, which says that laughter is a series of spasmodic and partly involuntary expirations with inarticulate vocalization normally indicative of merriment. That doesn't help much either, does it? But they do tell us that to smile is a silent form of laughter. Now let's just for a minute here, everybody smile. Look at the person next to you. Just give them a big toothy grin. Doesn't that make you feel good? Now give me one, because I'm a little nervous up here. Well, when you smile, you're engaging in a silent form of laughter. And they say you use less muscles when you smile than when you frown. And basically, you feel better when you smile. Now, the scientists who've studied laughter tell us that when we're laughing, the movements of our chest and voice box are exactly opposite to when we're under distressful situation and screaming. Now they tell us that when we're laughing, we take in more air than we put out. And the way our speech mechanism works, we need air in order to produce sound. In other words, we bring air up from the lungs across the vocal cords. And the vocal cords are like rubber bands which stretch, and they produce noise. And the noise we shape into words using our tongue and our teeth and our lips so that we can be understood by other people. Now you need that air supply coming across the vocal cords to produce noise. Now with laughter, they tell us we take in more air than we put out. However, a person who screams uses up all his air, and hence a person can scream and reach a point where they can't scream anymore. But you ever notice a person starts laughing, they can just keep it up and keep it up and keep it up, and sometimes they start crying and the whole thing. Well, that's because they have an ample air supply. Now, it's really very difficult to define what laughter is. Basically, laughter is the reaction to the emotion that we call amusement. Now, we have a similar circumstance in the Bible when the Apostle Paul in 1 Corinthians 13 talks about love. You notice he never tells us what love is. He merely tells us what love does and what love refrains from doing. Well, so it is with laughter. We don't know what amusement is. All we know is that when we're amused, we laugh. Now, there have been theories over the years as to why people laugh. Perhaps the most interesting but least scientific was the one the Greeks had back in the days of Hippocrates, their golden age. Now, the Greeks believed that everybody had liquids in their body, and these four liquids were called the humors. You might say, what does the word humor have to do with liquid? Well, we have a similar word in our vocabulary, humid, or humidity, which isn't a problem out here, but in the East Coast where I was, it was a problem. And you knew what a humid day was. It was a sticky day where you could almost see the atmosphere, feel it. Well, to the Greeks, the four liquids in the body, or the four humors, were blood, phlegm, choler or yellow bile, and melancholy or black bile. Now these four humors, if any one of them was flowing in your circulatory system more predominantly than the other three, that was your mood at that particular moment. For example, if blood was the humor that was flowing, then you were passionate, interested in wine, women, and song. Hot-blooded is the expression. If it was the phlegm, then the person was sluggish and lazy. If it was the choler or the yellow bile, then the person was irritable, hard to get along with. And if it was the melancholy, then the person was deep in thought. Now today, we have an expression, we speak about a person out of humor. Well, it goes back to that idea that the Greeks had, that one of the humors was out of balance. Now the Greeks also believed that you had a laughter vein. If your laughter vein got struck, then you laughed whether you felt like it or not. And so they tell the story about a knight who was struck in his arm where his laughter vein was, and he laughed himself to death. Well, so much for that. Now the Bible is also silent as to the cause of laughter, but we do find some interesting observations. For example, in 1 Timothy 1:11, we're told that Jehovah God is a happy God. Also, in the same book, in the last chapter, we are told that Jesus Christ is the happy potentate. In Genesis chapter 1, verse 28, we are told that man was created in the image of God. Now, we've already mentioned that the animals do not have a sense of humor. They cannot laugh. So the fact that we can laugh and have a sense of humor, and we are created in God's image, and it came from God. Now, Charles Darwin, noted evolutionist, made a similar observation. He said, in all races of men, the expression of good spirit seems to be the same and is easily recognized. His basic premise, in other words, is everybody can laugh or wants to laugh. Now, you might say, does Jehovah have a sense of humor? Well, he certainly does. Just look at the animal creation. Why, there's all kinds of shapes and sizes. We just look at it and say, man, Jehovah must have had a sense of humor, the designs that he came up with here. For example, look at the elephant, with a long nose and a tail and back. If you never saw one before, you wouldn't know what it was or which was front or back. As a matter of fact, that's how the Romans were defeated by Hannibal, because he used elephants, came across the Alps with elephants. It just scared the Romans. They had never seen anything like that before. You see, they were awestruck by these creatures. What about the rhinoceros? A big, ugly creature, big, long horn on the front. They say a rhinoceros will run after you, but all you got to do is just take a step to the right or the left, and it'll just pass you like a freight train. Well, here's another animal you might think about. That's the platypus. Now, a Qantas Airlines ad described the platypus as a duck-billed, beaver-tailed, web-footed furry critter that builds a nest at the end of a tunnel, lays eggs, suckles its young, and looks like it was designed by some drunken committee. Well, it wasn't designed by a drunken committee, but it does look like it was made from leftover spare parts from the rest of the animal creation, doesn't it? But you know, more than shapes and sizes and the variety in the animal kingdom, it's the antics of the animals that give us the explanation to where laughter comes from, and that is surprise. I think all of us have experienced a cat with a ball of yarn. You ever notice how the cat chases a ball of yarn, he gets his claws caught and runs across the room and skids on the tile floor perhaps, or runs up the back of the furniture? Before long we're laughing. It's because the reaction of that animal to this ball of yarn surprises us. We do not expect the reaction. We're caught off guard. For example, we were at a picnic and saw a cat and a squirrel. The squirrel was in the grass, and the cat was also crouched down ready to pounce on the squirrel. And the squirrel would take a couple of steps, and the cat would follow it. But as soon as the squirrel turned around and looked at the cat would just stop motionless. You could hardly even see it breathing. And this kept on for quite a few lengths of distance there. And finally, the squirrel took a dash and ran up the tree, and the cat followed it, and the squirrel got to a place where it could not be reached by the cat, turned around the cat, and waved its tail. See, those type of things can take us off guard. We're surprised. And that's really the basis of humor, is surprise. Now, the word humor, or our sense of humor, and scientists are telling us there's more than just the 5 senses that we have, you know, the tactile senses, touch, sight, smell, and so forth. But our humor is also another sense. And the definition of humor is the sense within us that allows us to think about the incongruities or inconsistencies of life in a kindly way. Now, it tells us that the element of kindliness is essential to humor. For example, we have situations come up to us all the time. And some of them make us upset, and some of them we don't even care about, and others we can laugh about. Well, what's the difference? Well, it's our viewpoint toward those circumstances. If we cannot tolerate a circumstance, then we're angry about it. We get upset. But if we can tolerate it, if we can take a kindly viewpoint toward it, then we laugh about it, or we smile about it. Now, the definition of humor says that element of kindliness is essential to laughter. Now, in the Bible, one of the fruits of God's Spirit is kindness. So you see, our expression of our sense of humor in laughter, because we can kindly view a situation, is really the result of the display of one of the fruits of God's Spirit. So there's a lot of things in life that can make us laugh, things that don't fit the normal routine, that get us out of the rut. But it's when they come as a surprise, that's when we laugh. Now, we can illustrate this with a joke. I'm not going to tell a joke, I'm going to tell you what happens when you hear a joke. The first time the joke is told, you don't know what the punchline is. The person lays out the story, and then he tells you the punchline, and you don't expect it. So the result of the surprise is the reaction of laughter. Now, the second time the joke is told, you know the punchline. It's not as funny. The third time, it's worse. Unless you're trying not to hurt the person's feelings, you know, and you sort of force a little laughter. Now, the practical joke illustrates the same thing. If we turn our Bibles to Proverbs chapter 26, verse 18 and 19, we have a description of the practical joke there. Now, why they're practical, no one seems to know. It's sort of a wrong name. But Proverbs 26, 18 and 19 says there, just like someone mad that is shooting fiery missiles, arrows, and death, so is the man that has tricked his fellow man and has said, was I not having fun? Now, an example of a practical joke is pulling the chair out from underneath someone when they sit down. That's really a bad thing to do. A person can be severely injured. But the person who finds any laughter in that, if there is any to be found, it's not the circumstance, it's the expression of surprise on the person's face, or the fact that he has to flail his arms or do something, you know, when he realizes he's off balance. Slapstick comedy also capitalizes on the surprise. We've probably seen the situation 100 times, and it's still funny. There's a high society ball, the hostess with the mostest long gown, pearls, pinchy glasses that quiver on the end of her nose with a string down to her lapel, and she's hit out of nowhere with a cream pie. Well, high society balls don't turn into pie throwing contests. But the element of surprise is there, and an element or an atmosphere of laughter is produced, so the person continues laughing. So the Awake magazine sums it up this way. Humor must present a surprising situation that has something out of the ordinary or abnormal or wrong about it, but this wrongness must not be severe enough to unlock emotions that would smother our enjoyment, emotions such as hate, fear, or overwhelming sympathy. Now, are there benefits to laughing? Well, there really are. And when we look at it from that viewpoint, we'll see that laughter is really an expression of love on Jehovah's part, the fact that we have the sense of humor and the ability to laugh. Now, one of the most striking examples of laughter's physical benefit is the case of Norman Cousins, who used to be the editor-in-chief of the Saturday Review magazine. Now, he had gone on a trip, and from sheer exhaustion, he'd gotten a very rare case of arthritis of the spine, and he had a doctor's chance in 1 in 500 in being cured of that. He could barely even move his thumbs without pain because of this condition. So he read up on the subject, and he decided, well, there might be some benefit to laughter. In the article in Newsweek, it said, Norman Cousins discovered the medicine in laughter. Negative emotions could have negative effects on the body. What about positive emotions? He tried an extraordinary experiment showing himself Marx Brothers films and clips from candid camera. Quote, he says, it worked. 10 minutes of genuine belly laughter had an anesthetic effect and would give me at least 2 hours of pain-free sleep. Tests taken before and after laughter showed a positive drop in his red blood cell sedimentation rate, a key diagnostic feature. Laughter had only one negative side effect. It disturbed other patients. So Cousins continued his cure in a hotel at a third the cost with nobody waking him up to give him a sleeping pill. Well, he cured himself. In 10 years, he was completely cured. It mentions that within a week, he was able to move his thumbs without pain, and he just continued. He'd go to sleep, and when he woke up in pain, he'd turn on the movies again or read some more humor books, and he just cured himself, laughing himself well. Well, laughter has some more immediate benefits. It's a tension reliever. For example, the Watchtower once made the comment, do not stand there and worry, do something, and if you can't do anything, then why worry? Good sense, isn't it? Well, there is an alternative, and that is find the humorous side of the situation. For example, Reader's Digest has a column called Laughter, the Best Medicine, where they tell little stories of where the tense situation was relieved with just a little bit of humor. So it does work. Now, the Awake magazine cited one authority who called laughter a luxury reflex. In other words, it's nice to have, but it's a little extra that God gave us. Its only function is to provide relief from tension. The explosive exhalations of laughter seem designed to puff away tension in a kind of respiratory gymnastics. Well, what that means is it gives your body a good workout when you laugh. For example, a person who has a desk job, and let's say sits at a typewriter all day, with his hands in this position on the keyboard, his neck turned to look at the manuscript that he's typing. After a while, everything gets so tense, when you stop, your neck just wants to go this way automatically, and you put your hands down, they almost want to come back up here, The muscles are so used to being in that same position. Tense. Well, the way to get rid of that tension is to have a change of pace, exercise. So people play tennis or jog or something like that. Well, when you laugh, you're giving your whole respiratory system, your breathing apparatus, a relief of tension. Now, the Awake magazine told the story of two psychiatrists who wound up in the concentration camps of Germany during World War II. Now, these two men didn't have the truth. They were not Jehovah's Witnesses. But these two men were able to survive their experience by each taking a turn every other day, thinking up some funny story of what they would do when they got out of the concentration camp. And they had to tell the other, and they'd have a good belly laugh every night about this. Well, they survived the concentration camps. Now, our brothers no doubt used their sense of humor, but it's never really been reported on, and of course they had a hope in the future. But when you think about these men, these two worldly individuals, they had the right view here. Number one, it was a humorous story. Number two, they thought about it all day long, which kept their mind off their plight in the concentration camp. And number three, it was something that would happen to them when they got out of the concentration camp, so it gave them hope. So on those 3 points, they were able to survive their experience. Now, the article the Awake magazine quoted from said, if humor can be used successfully against odds like those, then what can't you and I do with it in daily life? Now, we've already mentioned that negative emotions have a deleterious or negative effect on the body. For example, asthma, digestive disorders, acne, everything has been linked to such things as jealousy and rage. And you know, in the Bible, in Proverbs chapter 14 and verse 30, that principle is told to us. You'll notice there it says, a calm heart is the life of the fleshly organism, but jealousy is rottenness to the bones. Now, another Bible translation says it's cancer to the bones. If you get cancer of the bones, it's definitely terminal, because the bones is where the red marrow, where the red blood cells are produced. And if the bones go, then the red blood cells are not produced and the person is going to die. You notice it says jealousy will cause that. But if we have a calm heart, because we have a good disposition, a sense of humor, we're going to be better off. Now, just to give some specific examples of how beneficial laughter is, the way the body is designed, we have our lungs. Underneath the lungs is a muscle called the diaphragm, involuntary muscle. It just works all the time. It causes the lungs to expand and contract, take air in and put out carbon dioxide. Well, underneath the diaphragm are all the organs in the abdomen. And whenever we laugh, we give all the organs in the abdomen a massage, which is beneficial. For example, there's the liver, which secretes bile, which helps us to break down the fat that we take into our digestive system. Well, that's helped by laughter. There's the pancreas, which secretes insulin, which is important for the digestion of sugars. Then there's the adrenals, or the adrenals, which produce the hormone adrenaline. Now, people sometimes will have a surge of adrenaline. They speak of their adrenaline being up, and they can do almost superhuman feats because they've got this hormone pumped into their system at great dosages. But now, if we have a good sense of humor and a balance about us, then the adrenaline comes into our system at a nice, steady rate. And this gives us the vigor and the confidence to meet day-to-day problems. And then as far as the intestines are concerned, laughter is cheaper and more effective than X-Lax for promoting regularity. So we can't beat that. Now, there's other organs, too, that are helped by laughter. For example, the lungs. Now, in our day-to-day breathing, we accumulate stale air in the bottom of our lungs. When we laugh, we get the stale air out. Our thyroid is stimulated. The thyroid controls the rate at which our body burns up the food we take in and turns into energy. And, of course, the hypothalamus, which is the master gland, is also benefited by laughter. Now, mentally, there are benefits to laughter. The Awake magazine quoted a pediatrician who observed that children who had ulcers, if you can imagine, were children who had no sense of humor. They couldn't laugh at themselves or anybody else. Another psychiatrist named Smiley Blanton, I guess he was well named, he said, I've seldom been called on to help a person who had a sense of the ridiculous. And note this, I've never had to treat anyone who could really laugh at himself. Now, the Awake tied this in with Romans 12:3, where the Apostle Paul said that everyone should not think more of ourselves than it is necessary to think, but to think so as to have a sound mind. Well, the way to have a sound mind is to have a sense of humor. Now, another doctor made this observation. He's been spending 30 years helping people not to laugh at particularly jokes, but to view the paradoxes in life with humor. He calls it the natural high. 3 points is what he gives. He says, number one, a person must realize that his or her lowering of self-esteem may be triggered by negative thoughts, such as, I'm no good, they're no good, life is tragic, nothing can change. So he teaches the person to strive for self-esteem. Number two, he tries to encourage the person to have more interest in the lives of others, creating a sense of belonging. And number three, he's an advocate of concentration on our inner qualities of creativity, imagination, and love. Well, when you think about it, that's what Jehovah's Witnesses teach, isn't it? We should view ourselves as somewhat important, not overly so, but we are representative of God. Number two, we should be interested in other people's lives. That's why we go from door to door. And number three, we want to stimulate love, incite others to love and find works, as the Bible says. So the Watchtower sums it up this way. It says, like speech and weeping, laughter is a form of self-expression. Note this, essential to our welfare. And by laughter, we are able to communicate our joy to others in an infectious way. Isn't it true that if someone's laughing, everybody wants to run over and find out what they're laughing about? Went on to say, joy shared is joy doubled, even as grief shared is grief halved. Now, if you have a heavy problem, you go talk to someone about it. You know, even if there's nothing they can do, they just listen. It's just like your problem is halved. Of course, if you have a great experience, let's say out in the door-to-door work, you know, and you come back and you're all bubbly about it, you tell everybody, and they get all excited, just like the experience gets better. Sometimes it does, it gets told from person to person. But it's true, when you have a joy and you share it, it gets better. When you have a grief and you share it, it gets cut in half. And the Watchtower went on to say this, laughter helps us bear the present, even as forgetfulness relieves us of the burdens of the past, and hope helps us face the future. See, there's the Christian's position in a nutshell. Jehovah's forgotten the past. We should forget it. We don't have to worry about the things we've done in the past. The ransom of Jesus Christ covers all that. We have hope based upon the Scriptures to face the future. We're not worried about tomorrow. And for right now, with its problems, well, we have laughter. We've got all the bases covered, so to speak. Well, what are some of the forms of humor? We're just going to briefly discuss this, but we have to think, first of all, of the Bible principles in Ephesians chapter 4, verse 29. See, this is what governs the Christian's sense of humor. Ephesians chapter 4 and verse 29. The Apostle Paul is very emphatic here. He says, let a rotten saying not proceed out of your mouth, but whatever saying is good for building up as the need may be, that it may impart what is favorable to the hearers. Now you notice he says, whatever saying is good for building up as the need may be. Well, sometimes the need is humor, and it builds up. And it does impart what is favorable to the person who hears it. Notice he says rotten sayings are not to come out of our mouths. And in chapter 5, he goes on to explain what he means by that. In verses 3 and 4, he says, let fornication and uncleanness of every sort or greediness not even be mentioned among you, just as it befits holy people, neither shameful conduct, nor foolish talking, nor obscene jesting, things which are not becoming, but rather the giving of thanks. Now, it is true, we do talk about fornication, uncleanness, but we talk about it from Jehovah's viewpoint. In other words, this is what Jehovah disapproves, and we have to know what he disapproves. But we don't talk about it with the idea that we get pleasure from these things. That's the difference. So now, what are some of the forms of humor? Well, words can be funny. You have the example of a pun. A pun is a play on words. There's a Bible pun for you. Why was David able to kill Goliath with just one small stone? Well, the answer is nothing like that had ever entered the giant's head before. That sometimes takes time to sink in. So does that. Probably the best one is right out of the Aid book, which is our Bible dictionary. It says in there, the Philistines wanted some amusement, so they brought Samson out, only to have him bring the house down. Now, another area, of course, are characters. We've probably seen movies where you have a very tall, big man, and he speaks with a high, squeaky woman's voice or something like that. Walt Disney used it in Fantasia. He's got hippopotamuses dancing ballet with crocodiles. That was a very incredible situation, very humorous. Situations can be funny. You have your situation comedies, you know, which are borderline slapstick. Then you have parodies. Now, a parody is a takeoff on a well-known work. For example, when we were in New York, there was a play, Richard III, which was a Shakespeare play that was written to Richard Nixon's career as President of the United States. It made fun of him from the viewpoint of Shakespeare. But now, when a parody gets written down, it's called a satire. Now, sometimes people will confuse satirical and sarcastic. Actually, sarcastic is a very strong word. It comes from the Greek word meaning to tear flesh or to bite the lips in rage. Now in the Bible we've got a borderline case of sarcasm in 1 Kings 18:27. Now just to get the setting here, this is when Elijah had challenged the priests and prophets of Baal to a test. And of course whoever was worshiping the true God was going to be able to build an altar and have fire come down from heaven and start the sacrifice. So they both built their altars, Elijah and the prophets of Baal, and they put their sacrifices on there. And the priests and prophets of Baal were dancing around the altar, and they were slashing themselves with knives, and blood was flowing, and they were just making a real big hoopla over all this thing. And this went on all morning, you know, like for about 3 hours, if you can imagine. It's like a wild party that wouldn't quit. Finally, Elijah had it up to here. And this is what he said in verse 27. It came about at noon that Elijah began to mock them. In other words, sarcasm here. And say, call at the top of your voice, for he is a god. For he must be concerned with the matter, and he has excrement and has to go to the privy. Maybe he's asleep and ought to wake up. We don't think of things like this with God. You know, he's been to the outhouse, or maybe he's deaf, or maybe he's asleep. So it was a borderline case of sarcasm. Another area of humor is called wit. This is a person who's witty is someone who can just cause everyone to go into stitches with just a couple of words because they discover circumstances that we always thought belonged together, and they show why that's actually ridiculous to put the two together, or vice versa. The last area is nonsense. These are words that don't really convey any idea. And in Alice in Wonderland, Alice with the Looking Glass by Lewis Carroll, he wrote a poem called Jabberwocky where he made fun of the English language. Today in the dictionary, Jabberwocky means any expression that's so full of technical leads you can't understand what they're talking about. For example, in one biology book, it says the biota exhibited a 100% mortality response, which means all the fish died. Or what is the anatomical juxtaposition of dual orbicularis oris muscles in a state of contraction? Sounds horrible, doesn't it? That's a kiss. Now, in the Bible, we have the very first mention of laughter in Genesis chapter 17 and verse 17. Now, we assume there was laughter in the Garden of Eden, but evidently didn't last too long because of what happened there. I mean, they were thrown out. As they say, Eve ate Adam out of house and home. Verse 17 of Genesis 17 says, at this, Abraham fell upon his face and began to laugh. The saying in his heart, will a man 100 years old have a child born? Will Sarah, yes, will a woman 90 years old give birth? Well, that is kind of a funny situation, isn't it? But now if you go across the page to the 18th chapter, you find Sarah's response was also laughter. This is when Jehovah asked the question, why did Sarah laugh? You notice there, starting in verse 12, it says, hence Sarah began to laugh inside herself, saying, after I am worn out, shall I really have pleasure, my Lord, being old besides? Then Jehovah said to Abraham, why was it that Sarah laughed, saying, shall I really and truly give birth, although I have become old? Is anything too extraordinary for Jehovah? At the appointed time I shall return to you next year at this time, and Sarah will have a son. Sarah began to deny it, saying, I did not laugh, for she was afraid. At this he said, no, but you did laugh. Now Sarah gets rebuked and Abraham doesn't. What's the difference here? Could we say that a funny thing happened to Sarah on the way back to the tent one day? What tickled her funny bone? Well, sometimes when you tell people a good thing, they just sort of chuckle about it. You know, they're happy about it. And that's evidently what Abraham did here. You know, he kind of laughed and he was so happy about it. But Sarah laughed it off. To her, this was totally incredible. She didn't believe it could possibly happen. Now we ask the question here, was Sarah lying? You know, she says, no, I didn't laugh. So Sarah is held up as an example for Christian women. As a matter of fact, Peter says, she was so submissive to Abraham, she called him my Lord. Well, if you go back to verse 12, you see where Sarah laughed. It says, Sarah began to laugh inside herself. And in her heart, she called Abraham my Lord. This is the only place in the Bible where Sarah calls Abraham my Lord. And that's what Peter talks about when he says that she's such a good example for Christian women in submission because she called Abraham my Lord. Never even did it out loud, just in her heart. Well, see, because Sarah did it in her heart, she could say, I didn't laugh, and she was right. She wasn't lying. But Jehovah, who could read hearts, would say, oh, yes, you did. Now, it's interesting that the name of her son was Isaac. Now, that doesn't mean anything to us in English. But in Hebrew, it's Yitzhak, or that's close anyway. And that is the name, or rather the name Isaac actually means laughter. So, whenever Sarah called her son's name, she was saying, laughter, clean up your tent. Laughter, put your toys away. Laughter, take the garbage out. Laughter, do this. Laughter, do that. And every time she called her named son, she was reminded of the fact that she laughed at Jehovah God when he said a 90-year-old woman would have a son. Very clever, wasn't it? Until she died, she was reminded of that. They tell us that in Hebrew, the word to laugh is an onomatopoeic word. An onomatopoeia is a word that imitates a sound. For example, in English, buzz imitates the sound that bees make. Bees buzz, bells ring, and if you speak Spanish, you can make it sound more like a bell if you roll that R there. Well, In Hebrew, it's tzahak. If you say it enough, tzahak, 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 sounds like you're laughing. I guess at least if you have Hebrew ears or something like that. Now, King Solomon talked about the importance of laughter. In Ecclesiastes 3:4, he said there's a time for everything, a time to laugh and a time to cry. But in that same Bible book, in chapter 2, an observation on laughter in verses 1 and 2. Now, King Solomon says there, on page 760 if you're using the New World Translation, I said, even I in my heart, do come now, let me try you out with rejoicing. Also see good, and look, that too is vanity. Now, King Solomon is talking about giving life a good try. In other words, trying everything you possibly could in a lifetime. And that's what Solomon did, because if you look over in verses 3 to 9, it says that he tried everything, from pools and houses and parks, and it mentions he had flocks and livestock and maidservants and men servants and female singers and male singers, and it says a lady, even ladies. But you notice he says in verse 2, laughter is insanity and rejoicing. What is this doing? See, King Solomon realized that just to laugh for the sake of laughing isn't really satisfying. It needs to have some substance behind it. It needs to be indicative of a deeper joy that we have within ourselves. Now in chapter 7 of the same Bible book, Solomon explains in detail a little more on the subject of laughter. Now we have to look at verse 1 to get the setting here. He says, a name is better than good oil on the day of death than the day of one's being born. Boy, that's the height of pessimism, isn't it? Well, actually not. See, Solomon is saying that a reputation is better than good oil or all the luxuries of the world, oil representing luxury, and it even does today. But he mentions there the day of death is better than the day of birth, because when we're born, we are a big question mark. Oh, there's genetic detail there. There's potential, but no one knows what's going to happen with that potential until we're done. And then we're either a yes or a no with God at the end of our life, at the point of our death. Now Solomon's saying at the time of a funeral or at the time of death, let's consider the rest of these verses here. Verse 2 goes on, better is it to go to the house of mourning than to the banquet house, because that is the end of all mankind, and the one alive should take it to his heart. Now, Solomon's not saying we should go around with a long face all the time and, be worried and sad, melancholy. No, he's saying that when there's a funeral, that's not the time to be rejoicing and banqueting. That's the time to be thinking about life seriously. What are we doing with our life? Are we making it count? He goes on in verse 3, better is vexation than laughter, for by the crossness of the face the heart becomes better. And we can't be laughing all the time. But he's saying that there are things in life that just aren't funny. Old age, sickness, and death, for example. Maybe Satan the devil thinks they're funny, but Jehovah doesn't. Neither do we. But he's saying, how are we living our life? Are we making the time count, or are we wasting our time, God's time, and everybody else's time? He says, if that's the case, then we have every reason to be vexed with ourselves, and this vexation is going to improve the quality of our heart. In verse 4, he says, the heart of the wise ones is in the house of mourning, but the heart of the stupid ones is in the house of rejoicing. Better is it to hear the rebuke of someone wise than to be the man hearing the song of the stupid ones. Well, again, are we tuned in to the people around us? Is our life good and right? If we go off the straight and narrow, who's going to put us back on there? Not the stupid ones, morally stupid. It's the wise one that will put us back on the course to love. Then he says in 6, as the sound of thorns under the pot, so is the laughter of the stupid one, and this too is vanity. Well, in the Middle East, you take thorns, which they can be found very easily, and you put them into a fire, they crackle and flare up, and then they're all gone. Nothing to them. This makes a lot of noise. It gets everybody's nerves. Well, that's the way it is with laughter that's inappropriate, ill-timed, and out of place. It's irritable. You see. So we need to be judicious in our use of our sense of humor and our laughter. Now, in the Bible, we have no record of Jesus' laughter. We do know that he attended a wedding feast. He turned water into wine, and the scriptures say that wine was made to make man's heart rejoice, which would indicate, laughter and enjoyment. But we do find in Luke chapter 6, Jesus made a comment on laughter. Matter of fact, this is the only comment he made on it. Luke chapter 6, verses 21 to 25. B, second half of the verse. There's two paragraphs in the verse here.
Luke 6:21 says, "Happy are you who weep now, because you will laugh." And then if you go over to verse 25, "Woe, you who are laughing now, because you will mourn and weep." Jesus was talking about the religious situation in Jerusalem in this day. You had your Pharisees and scribes, the religious leaders of that time. They had everything going for them. They had the front seats in the synagogues, the greetings in the marketplaces, and everybody looked up to them, and so forth and so on. Wealthy. And yet Jesus said there would come a time when there would be a reversal in their situation. In other words, they enjoyed it, and the common people who were listening to Jesus were just getting the crumbs scripturally from these individuals. So Jesus said the time would come when it wouldn't matter whether you had the front seats in the synagogues. And that happened in 70 CE when the Romans came against the city of Jerusalem. It didn't matter who you were. Just if you were a Jew, you either left as a slave or you were killed. It didn't matter whether you were rich or poor. So those who didn't listen to Jesus were the ones who would weep. Be nothing to laugh about or be happy over in 70 CE. But the Christians who listened to Jesus and got out of the city of Jerusalem, were up there in the mountains, the other side of the Jordan River, they had reason to rejoice, be happy, or even laugh because they listened to Jesus. They warned these persons, so these persons were not ignorant of the fact that destruction was coming. Jesus even said the city would be surrounded by encamped armies, and they would build a fortification of pointed stakes, and they did, and they starved the city out. So their ignorance cost them their lives. In the Bible, we find that laughter can take the form of derision. In Job chapter 41, Leviathan, or the crocodile, is spoken of as laughing at the rattling of a javelin. Now, the crocodile has no natural enemy. Even ordinary bullets will ricochet off the hide of a crocodile. You need a high-powered rifle in order to kill it. So a javelin is just inconsequential to a crocodile. We find that Jehovah God in the 2nd Psalm speaks about laughing at the nation. He says that they are like the film of dust on the scale. In other words, when your sisters go to the supermarket, you don't pull out a handkerchief and wipe the scale before you put the tomatoes in there. It doesn't even register. And that's the way the nations are to Jehovah God. So their peace talks and their disarmament and their arms race and all of that is just laughable as far as Jehovah God is concerned. Why, just look at Mount St. Helens. More power than any explosion man could produce, and that's just like a pimple on the face of the earth. No effort whatsoever. So it shows how little and inconsequential man is. Now in the Bible, in the 33rd Psalm, verse 12, we have the basic reason why there's very little happiness, true happiness in the world today. Psalm 33:12. It said, "Happy is the nation whose God is Jehovah, the people whom he has chosen as his inheritance." Now there's no nation on earth that has in its constitution that Jehovah is its God. The only nation that ever had that was the nation of Israel. And the nation of Israel had it right there in the 10 Commandments. It mentioned there in the 10 Commandments, in the very first commandment, that Jehovah was their God, and that they were to worship him alone. And as long as they worshiped Jehovah God unreservedly, exclusively, then they were happy. But no matter where you go in the earth today, you don't find any nation in that situation. But in all the nations of the earth, you have a people who are worshiping Jehovah and have Jehovah in their constitution. That is, of course, Jehovah's Witnesses. No matter what nation you find them, they're happy, even though they're in another political environment. So collectively then, Jehovah's people are happy. But now, how is all this information going to help us on the individual basis? Well, we all hope to inherit God's kingdom, whether in heaven or on earth. And that means that right now we're putting on the new personality, which is a part of living there. Part of the Christian personality is our sense of humor. We need to get our sense of humor in line with Jehovah God's sense of humor. That means that we're going to laugh with Jehovah, laugh forever with him, not at him like the nations of today do. Who knows, there may be other things in nature we've never noticed that will amuse us, that Jehovah God created for our amusement that we've never even seen before. Also, this information should help us to get a more objective view of ourselves. Remember we talked about a kitten with a ball of yarn and how it made us laugh? Well, here we are, a higher form of life looking at a lower form of life and finding it amusing. Well, now let's just get it in the right perspective. We've got a higher form of life higher than us up in heaven looking down at us here on earth. Why, heaven must just roar sometimes with the sun's sweep hole. You think about the things that happen to us out in the field service.
Why, the scriptures speak about the angel flying in mid-heaven and supposed to be responsible for the preaching activity. Well, now, we laugh at the things that happen to us in service. You can just imagine this angel saying to his other friends in heaven, "You won't believe what the publishers did today. You've got to come and see this." Well, when we look at it from that viewpoint, we can see, well, what's the reason to get all uptight or upset at our brothers or anyone else in Jehovah's organization? Enjoy being a witness. Be happy. That's what the whole thrust is. If we have a balanced sense of humor, then we're going to try to find the humor in the situation. If there is humor to be found, there are some situations that you can't look at in a light way. But if it's possible to look at it in a light way, then let's do it that way. And if we use laughter as a gift from Jehovah God that's going to help us to imitate Him, because the Scriptures speak of Him as a happy God, well, this is going to attract people to Jehovah's organization, just as many things attract people. People speak about how happy we look. One woman says, "Why, all you witnesses have a witness smile." One psychiatrist said to me in the field service, she says, "You're deluded, but you're happy, and I envy you for that." And if that's the case, then the scripture in Zechariah 8:23 will certainly be fulfilled. It says there, "This is what Jehovah of armies has said. It will be in those days," talking about our days, "that 10 men out of all the languages of the nations will take hold." Yes, they will actually take hold of the skirt of a man who is a Jew. In other words, people of the nations would align themselves with Jehovah's anointed remnant, which represent Jesus Christ here on earth, saying, "We will go with you people." And they could even say, "We will laugh with you people." Why? For we have heard that God, that's Jehovah, the happy God, the one the scripture says laughs, is with you people. When you think about that, that's nothing to laugh about, is it?